Good morning, sociologists. Welcome to my third attempt at recording lesson 1 for you, which is defining development. The course is called Global Development, and therefore it means we have to start with what do we mean by the term development. And that's not as easy as it first appears. So what I intend to do today is talk you through several different definitions, several different ideas, but don't worry, there's no definitive answer, which is fitting given that we're talking about definitions. Pretty much anything goes, provided you know what you're doing with it. A lot of this course will require you to remember some facts and figures. You will be required to use those facts and figures. What I'm going to do now is give you a guide to the units that are used in those facts and figures and the types of facts and figures you might throw at the course. Don't worry, this isn't the whole course. You know how much I love demographics. You know how much I love a good bar chart. You don't have to use bar charts all the time, but because I'm me, I probably will start there because I find them fun. So anyway, here we have the globe and the question, what is development? Because I think it's a valid one to ask. And there it is. So you're going to be taking notes on this like you would in a normal lecture. Don't worry, there's not a lot of writing. A lot of this is talking through. So I will expect questions in the comments. I'll expect you to comment on things. I'll expect you to go backwards and forwards and pause. Please don't worry about that. I'll try and give as much time as I can. The first thing we need to discuss is what do we mean by rich and what do we mean by poor? Even though those two terms sound, well, obvious, they might not be. So for example, at the top here, I have an image of a man with a blue background, and I genuinely cannot remember his name. Back when I made this in 2016, he was involved in a major court case with Google to force the internet giant to remove his name from search engines. He succeeded. At the time of me making this, he had not, which is how come I found the picture. I have since forgotten his name. Nevertheless, why is he here? He's here as an illustration of the uber wealthy, the uber rich, the 1%. This man was so wealthy that through several front companies, he literally owns the sovereign debt of Argentina. And the reason I knew about him was because earlier that year, he'd impounded the flagship of the Argentinian fleet at Monaco so that they would pay him the debt that he felt he was owed at the rate he was owed it. What I'm looking at here, what you're looking at, is an individual who is so rich that they could literally buy and sell countries, literally, through their debt. That is the 1%. Beneath that, what is poor? What is poverty? What do we mean by this? And we have a group of Mexicans living in a rubbish tip. They're part of a large community, and their job basically is to recycle. The material that's placed there and dumped there is used by these communities to try and eke out a living. Clearly they have enough to eat, sort of, and clearly they have some form of shelter. In many ways, despite being economically poor, they are perhaps better off than richer people in the United Kingdom, for example, that don't have enough to eat, even now, and might still not have shelter. We've only got 95% of homeless people in shelter at the moment. And that's fascinating to me. So what is meant by poverty? What is meant by wealth? Do we mean the relativistic approach to those terms? Well, actually, for the course, I will introduce that. We'll talk about relative poverty, we'll talk about relative wealth, but it's just getting this idea across that your initial instinct might not be entirely the whole story, though you'll find that your initial instinct will fit most of what we discuss throughout this course. The next thing I want to talk about is what is poverty then? If it's not just economic poverty, if it's not just not having enough money, how do we do this? How do we apply it to the world? Because this course is all about how the world works. And the first thing I'm going to show you is this chart from Somalia in 2013, which when I made this in 2016 was the most recent data. I have checked since and I didn't find any updates. There may be some now. What we're looking at here is a population chart, and the geographers among you will already be champing at the bit telling me this is a population pyramid. And what we have here is 890,000 or so males, 0 to 4, and just shy of that females, males and females. Next one up, you've got just over 712,000 5 to 9s on both sides, and then it drops precipitously again for 10 to 14-year-olds, then again 20 to 24-year-olds, and then it drops a little bit less. What we have here is a high mortality rate, specifically a high infant mortality rate, a high IMR. There are childhood diseases, childhood problems that are leading to large amounts of death. And that is a sort of feature of poverty-stricken countries. To contrast that, I have the United Kingdom, also from 2013. And what we have here is, of course, as a geographer will tell you, an arrowhead formation, an arrowhead graph, an arrow graph. The reason being it goes in, out, and then in again on both sides. And what we see here is a demographic dip around about the ages of 10 to 14. So this was in 2013. These are people born between 2003 and 2007. I don't know if that includes you anymore. Might do. Anyway, that's the demographic dip. There's more children born afterwards. We know about this from our work on families and households, and our work on the fertility rate, and our work on family size. A developed nation will look a bit like this. You'll have a large sort of generation moving up the age brackets, and you'll have smaller generations following. As in the developed world, people have less children, they feel more secure, there's less reason to have multiple children, and there's less mortality, there's less reason to replace those children. So going back to Somalia, the other factor you'll see is high illiteracy rates. Now these are defined in this particular instance as the ability to read, write, and recognize one's own name. The illiteracy percent of those over the age of 15 in Somalia, on the whole, is around about 38%. Males get as far as 50% literacy, and females get as far as 27% literacy. In terms of the amount of schooling they receive, it's approximately 3 years, males receiving most of that, and females receiving just 2 years schooling. And you say, well, okay, that sounds pretty dire. How does that compare to the UK, a developed nation? How far adrift is Somalia? Well, the UK has 99.8% literacy over the age of 15. And that is pretty evenly distributed between men and women, or males and females. And as a total, the schooling is 17 years. You guys, of course, won't be able to leave until you're 18. But generations before you had the ability to leave at 16. Hence the discrepancy there of 17 years schooling. Males tend to leave at 16, whereas females tend to stay until they're 17. You've done work on that already in education. So back to Somalia then. You can see the contrast. There's also low levels of employment. Somalia's full-time employment rate, that is people involved in jobs that last and jobs that stick around and jobs that employ you full-time and are not temporary, is less than 29% in 2013. That means that fully 61% of the population is simply, no wait, not 61%, 71% of the population is not in secure, long-term, full-time employment. They might be in temporary contracts, and that can be a problem. This leads to a lack of security. This leads to people taking matters into their own hands. It leads to starvation. It leads to all manner of problems. You contrast that with the United Kingdom, which in 2013 was doing pretty badly, people thought, at unemployment. I'm sure that'll get worse now. And it was upwards of 92% in full-time employment. That's a huge number. It might sound bad, 8% unemployed, but yeah, compared to Somalia, it's obviously the feature of a rich nation. The last thing I want to talk about here is production diversity. That is what it is that the country actually makes. And you'll find the main exports of Somalia, bananas, sugarcane, coconuts, rice, mangoes, sesame seeds, and beans, are agricultural produce. These are easily affected by variations in the weather. They're easily affected by problems in harvesting. They're affected by conflict very easily, and they don't make a great deal of money. If one of them fails, chances are all of them have failed because they're agricultural produce. They rely on the same input. Contrast that with the UK and its exports, and you'll find that if one of those fail, chances are the other ones won't. We have manufactured goods, fuels, chemicals, processed food, processed beverages, tobacco, and there are others too. So I mean, tobacco being in the top 6 is weird, but there you go. These are things that aren't easily affected by climate change, aren't easily affected by variations in the weather. For the most part, if one fails, we've got something else to fall back on. The current crisis is interesting in that people have, I've got to stop saying and people are suggesting that we're going to end up in quite a deep depression. And one of the reasons they didn't think that to begin with was because of the diversity of things we produce. We'll see how that goes. Go back to there. Why is that? Well, some sociologists argue that there are severe social differences between the United Kingdom and Somalia. Somalia is tribal. Somalia has a much higher reliance on things like religion. It is a patriarchal society, and you can see that in the schooling and the literacy. It's very obvious who gets the benefit of the rewards of society. You look at that age pyramid, and it's very obvious who lives longer at a certain age. It's men, males. And that means a patriarchal society. There's also an element, and we'll talk about this more later, of ascriptivism. You're born into a family, you're born into a position, and you'll carry out your function regardless of whether or not you're any good at it. Contrast that with the United Kingdom, where up until this recent crisis, I would have said we're less tribal. I'm not sure about that now. And also we're less patriarchal. Maybe, just in different ways. We're certainly less ascriptivist, however, and that is that people can do pretty much what they want. Are we a full meritocracy? Matt Hancock and Dominic Raab are giving coronavirus briefings. Priti Patel gave a coronavirus briefing. Are we a meritocracy? It's a very open question. So what is meant by development then? If that's what poverty is, what do we mean by development? Well, mainly it's an economic term. It refers almost exclusively to how much money a society has and how much it produces. But there are several different ways of measuring this and talking about it. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the gross national product. I apologize now to any economists in the room because they know that this is an out-of-date reporting tool. They referred to the gross domestic product, and I ran into trouble a few years ago with an economist who said that this was essentially junk, that most people use the GNI. So I looked up the GNI and I found it, and I split it into 3 groups of countries. I took groups of countries that were widely acknowledged as being less economically developed countries, LEDCs. I believe the current geographic term is low-income countries, or LICs. And my low-income countries for this one were, hold on, I'll take my physical away again, Somalia, Nepal, India, Nigeria. I then took up-and-coming economies. Sometimes you might hear about the BRIC economies or the mint economies. And I had Ukraine, China, Brazil, and the Russian Federation. And then I took widely identified as being more economically developed, or MEDCs, or most developed MDCs, or high-income countries, HICs or HICs. And I took a few of those at the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, United States, and Switzerland. There's a reason I chose these countries, and I'll explain in a moment, or you'll see for yourselves. The GNI, and I forget what it stands for, is the amount of money, roughly speaking, produced by an economy divided by the number of people in it. That's the per capita part. So every person in Switzerland has about $81,000 worth of stuff produced in their name. The United States gets around 53,000. Canada, around about 52,000. Japan, around about 47,000. And the United Kingdom, around about 39,000. You can see why we are developed countries. Now, this was the data in 2013. It was the data I found at the time. It might even be as high as 2015. The next lot down are the Russian Federation, Brazil, China, and Ukraine. And you can see that very clearly on this chart. Below that, I tried to color Somalia, but I couldn't select it. It was so small. So here you can see that it's still blue. It's supposed to be red. On that basis, the UK is less developed than the United States, hence why I've color-coded them, but more developed than Somalia. Another way of looking at development in a sort of less economic way is life expectancy at birth in years. Now you'll see this chart starts at 50. Somalia in red gets to 51. Nigeria around about 53. Nepal weirdly skips ahead to around about 62. India 63. Ukraine 67 perhaps. Russian Federation goes almost to 70. Brazil into 73, though that is dropping. China almost to 75. The United States around about 78. The United Kingdom at the time was just over 80, though that is dropping. Switzerland ahead of us, Canada, and then Japan rockets to the top of the chart with nearly 84. And what you see here is that depending on how you measure development, depends on where the countries on that chart end up. You could argue that those that have a larger life expectancy are far more developed than those that don't. And in that case, the United States is less developed than the UK, which is why I colour-coded them and chose those two countries. The next thing you can talk about is the ability to shape how the country is run, your power, if you will, your freedom within a country. We call this the democracy quotient. And in the 1990s, it was a very big growth area. People were talking about, well, how democratic is a country? How much can the people of that country affect the trajectory, direction, and power structures within their country? The higher the democratic quotient, the better the rating, the better the development in many ways. And so in the early 2000s, there was a lot of work done to try and find a way of measuring it. You'll notice I don't have a chart. It turned out they couldn't. It was really hard to measure. You also had to take into account whether or not people trusted their democratic systems and institutions. And what the researchers found was that places you would have thought of as being more democratic, the United States, the United Kingdom, were often seen by the people living there as not being. And as a consequence, that caused a problem. The other thing that was thrown up was that some people felt perfectly actualized and happy in non-democratic situations. And there were other forms of government that had quite high approval ratings. And that didn't fit the researchers' thoughts and ideas and preconceived notions of what democracy was. So it rapidly fell apart, is my point. You could look at suffering. Are you developed if people are suffering in your country? And what we have here is the Human Suffering Index from 1992. It has never been updated. And the reason for that is simple. It's really hard to measure suffering. What are you measuring? Are we going to measure bereavement? And which bereavements count as excess suffering and which are just suffering? Do we count people dying of old age? Do we count people who are starving? Is that more or less suffering than people living on the street? Also, what does it mean to live on the street if you're a Bedouin tribe? I mean, it looks right, it feels right. You look at this data, you look at this map, you look at the dark red areas where there is extreme suffering, and you think, yeah, that fits. But how do you measure that? This is their attempt, and by the fact that it's never been repeated, you can see how difficult it was. Another way of looking at this is the Human Development Index, and I was told by economists that they use this. Geographers are aware of it, so I guess I mention it. The Human Index score goes between 0, you'll never achieve anything, to 1, you'll absolutely achieve everything you set out to do. Obviously, 1 is a theoretical maximum. No one can ever reach it. Otherwise, everyone in the country will be Supermen. There's always going to be someone who fails. Once again, the same groups of countries. And interestingly, they fall in the same bracket. No one overtakes someone in a different bracket. Somalia, Nigeria, Nepal, and India all remain in the developing bracket. China, Ukraine, Brazil, the Russian Federation all remain in the middle bracket. Japan, the United Kingdom, Canada, United States, and Switzerland all remain in the upper bracket. And once again, the order is restored. We are less developed than the United States. Canada comes between us. Japan is less developed than the United Kingdom this time, and Switzerland tops the thing again. Make of that what you will, but obviously Somalia is massively adrift and in a completely different league to even its close neighbours in terms of development of Nepal and India. China, Ukraine, Brazil, Russian Federation are in the middle, as we'd expect. Sorry, that made a noise, didn't it? Some terminology for you. You'll often hear me referring to North and South in this course. And what I mean is the global north and the global south. Now, it's worth pointing out, at this point in a lesson, I would show you the Map Men video about the North-South divide in the United Kingdom, which I think I've shown you before, but to remind you that the entire world can be divided into North and South. So at this point in the video, I would ask you to pause. I would ask you to look up the video link and just remind yourselves about that Map Men video. I know I find it funny and you probably don't. But interestingly, it points out there's a north-south divide in the entire world. And at that point, you need to pause it, as I would, to point out one weird inclusion in the north of the globe, which is Australia and New Zealand. They count as north, even though they're quite clearly in the southern hemisphere. So it's worth keeping that in mind, that there's something else going on here. It's not as simple as north and south, northern and southern hemispheres, though we often talk as if it is. And there's a reason for that. If I look at this map of the first, second and third world, you'll recall third world countries as being a term. And that means there are two other types of country, the first world countries and the second world countries. Well, here they are labeled. The first world countries are labeled in blue. The second world countries, the former communist bloc and others who are developing, are labeled in red. And the third world countries are labeled in green. And at first glance, this looks like it works reasonably well, until you realize that Ireland, over here, is in green, and that India is in green. They have their own space program. China is in red. Somalia is in red. Oh, that doesn't feel right, given what we know. So although these terms, first, second, and third world, are largely out of use and out of date, I will still use them because they're useful, catch-all, generalized terms, and because you kind of know what they mean. First world is pretty good, second world I won't mention very much, and third world countries, we tend to mean the less or least developed countries in the world, and that kind of works, even though the exactitudes of it might be slightly off. The other thing we're going to talk about is another way of looking at it. We've got advanced economies, transition economies becoming advanced economies, less developed and least developed. I just used those terms just now. And again, this feels right. And there's no weirdness with Ireland. There's no oddities with India and China. We have a transition economy for the Russian Federation, the former communist bloc, which makes a lot of sense. And then you've got Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa refers to anything in Africa that's below the Sahara, which is here. So it's these countries. We don't count South Africa among that. South Africa tends to be more developed, though interestingly it turns up here as being less developed. It used to be one of the more developed economies in the world when they had apartheid. I've got to stop saying I'm so sorry. Oh, there. The other way of looking at it is in terms of newly industrializing countries. And this was a term that was in vogue in the 1990s and was quite popular in the early 2000s as well. And there are two NIC groups that you need to know about. There's the BRIC countries, that's Brazil, Russian Federation, India, and China. It's just the way it is. And you see here very clearly their economic power as represented by these circles. China is almost the same size as the US. It's definitely an increasingly powerful industrial nation. Now, that was back in 2015. Nowadays, China is much more economically developed, and even with the hit provided by coronavirus, is probably going to be challenging the USA. Does that mean it's as developed as the United States? Well, clearly not. There are far more people living in China, so you have to spread that economic development around more, like, I don't know, putting on margarine on a piece of bread and then scraping it off again until there's very little left. You spread it very thinly. It's a much larger piece of bread than the United States. That is a ridiculous analogy, but I hope it worked. The other group that was quite popular was Mint, and that was Mexico, Nigeria, whoops, wrong way around, Indonesia, Nigeria, I don't have silly voices for all countries, don't worry, and Turkey. That was supposedly the next big thing, and loads of people invested loads of money, and then they found that these places were fundamentally unstable and not good investment opportunities and weren't growing as quickly as everybody hoped, and they kind of flopped. This was after 2008. Indeed, 2008 causes a great deal of consternation. We'll talk about that in a moment. And what we're going to try and talk about is poverty on a world scale. One, I talked about political instability. Here's the political instability index. And again, it looks reasonably right. This was compiled in 2015, 2016. And if you were to apply this, say, to the current situation, the USA and the UK are much higher on the political instability index, despite the fact that the UK has actually had the same government since 2010. The reason for that is we've had more elections than normal. And the reason for the USA's political instability, sorry, is down to the election of Trump in 2016 and the resultant division that's come from that. And he's certainly kind of stoking that as much as he can. Since 2008, there's been a great deal of change in all of this. The textbook that we will use, that you'll receive when you get back, was published in 2011. There's been no update to that. And as I've mentioned previously, that means the exam boards pretty much have to give you a free pass with anything you use from that textbook. I will attempt to update with examples. Much of what I've talked about here will not appear in the textbook fully because it was published in 2011 and I'm using figures that go right the way up to 2016. Much of what will follow in later slides and PowerPoints, I will have researched and added to. I will give you up-to-date information. That doesn't mean you have to remember it all, and if in doubt, revert to the textbook. I will also do things in a different order. I created the course before we had access to the textbook, and as a consequence, I will skip around that textbook a fair bit. Do not worry. If you wish to order your notes in the order of the textbook, that is not a problem. Students have done that before you and done exceptionally well. Equally, students have followed my pattern and ordered notes the way I do them in lessons and have done just as well. In other words, it's not a one-size-fits-all, it's what works best for you. I am not going to get upset regardless of how you do it, provided you realise there is a choice in the matter. You're in sixth form. At the end of the day, you can take responsibility for your own learning and everyone is okay with that. And that brings us to the end of this lesson, which I guess is the first in the sequence, and therefore I'm going to call it lesson 101 because I like my terms. Lesson 01. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was easy to follow. Hopefully you could pause at the right places. Hopefully I didn't gabble too much. I'm doing my best to slow down my speech, but I am aware that I still talk incredibly quickly. Any questions, pop them in the comments in the Show My Homework section. Any problems, do let me know, and I'll try and create another video. Unless these aren't working, do let me know if you don't like them. Do let me know if they don't work for you, because then I can stop doing them and come up with something else. In the meantime, stay safe, Year 12, and I'll see you in the next video.